our government has many systems that overly reward incumbency and age. And many candidates pressed on this over the years have faced down the age issue with responses that range from tradition to humor.
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
Seniority does mean something in the United States Senate.
I know that I'm someone older than you. I'm standing here as proof that in America, the possibilities are unlimited.
What do you say to people? You're too old. Let the younger person now take the mantle.
Look, I think we should judge people on the totality of their lives. They can say that about you.
What do you say to your doubters who say, too old?
I heard the same thing in 2016 when I was 81 or 2, and here I am.
Now, many of those responses are true. That last poll, Senator Grassley was well over the traditional retirement age, but he did win over voters for re-election. He had that sort of mantle or legitimacy. You saw Bernie Sanders there. Well, he won far more support in his party than many younger rivals that he faced, and even his fan base was far younger than other politicians' supporters. So he built a really big, and in that sense of age, young and diverse coalition, which is a rebuttal to the idea that he was past his time, and that Sanders' coalition with a lot of excited young people may offer lessons for Biden that he will need by this November. But some of the other answers I just showed for you were not about government rules or substance. Senator Gordon referred to seniority. Well, Congress just has rules that give out the majority of powerful posts to people who've been there the longest. This has nothing to do with Biden or Trump, and this is a long-running rule. Virtually every powerful committee post, which controls the money or what legislation even gets a vote, goes to the longest-serving members who are usually the oldest. And that means one demographic group ends up with much more outsized power than any other cohort in America. Again, that's not anti that group. It's just saying they're taking up a lot more power than anybody else in a supposed democracy. We hear a lot of talk about divisions on race or gender or other groupings. Most committees, though, are run in Congress by one group, this older incumbency group of long-serving politicians rewarding themselves. It's not ageist to ask whether the whole nation should run this way. Those rules, combined with the broader trend of people living longer nowadays, have combined to create something that is not representative. And then when you look at wealthier elites who have access to the best health care, that's driven up the average age of Congress by about a decade just since the 70s. In both chambers, the average senator is now at the typical retirement age, and you can just add 6 years to that because they serve those 6-year terms. So, for example, a 64-year-old senator under their job will reach 70 when they finish that term. Now, the Constitution's founders, the Founding Fathers, they may not have predicted this. They have systems here that continue to reinforce that incumbency I mentioned. Consider that the position of Senator pro temp is in the line of succession to the president. Now, imagine if we had a tragedy like in the movie 2012, where several senior officials die. Well, right after the VP, the presidency then goes to the Speaker of the House. In 2022, that would have been the 82-year-old Speaker Pelosi. And after that, the next person in line is that position I mentioned, the Senate pro temp. In 2022, that was 81-year-old Democrat Patrick Leahy. He was born in 1940, back when FDR was president, served as Vermont senator for 48 years. Again, no disrespect to his experience and wisdom, but it is a relatively old, random rule that says of all the people in government or America, he would step up. It's a fair question whether in a doomsday scenario with recently dead or killed American leaders, whether that is the best plan we can come up with for an emergency president. Big companies do succession planning. None of them use the system we are using to this day, and none of those companies have nuclear arsenals. The stakes are even higher for the federal government. Large companies and nonprofits make supposedly substantive or meritocratic choices about who should lead. They don't make the longest tenured employee just the head of product or CFO or CEO, which is kind of what Congress does with these committees. Now consider how as recently as 2001, when I mentioned that succession plan under these antiquated rules, the third person in line to take over the presidency was then 98-year-old Strom Thurmond, who had health challenges. He was few people's idea of a emergency president. He rose to prominence as a bigot racist running for president all the way back in 1948. His platform was segregation. And these are the kind of health challenges that are relevant today. And again, this is not just about one party. By definition, we're talking about rules and systems and maybe uncomfortable conversations. But these are issues for very powerful people who just stay in these posts, like the late Democratic Senator Feinstein or the GOP's current leader, Senator McConnell.
Are you proud of being the oldest man ever to serve?
That one over there.
Well, not necessarily. I'm just trying to do a good job.
Submitted.
Yeah, just say aye.
Okay, just aye.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I had a hard time hearing you.
That's okay. What are your thoughts on running for re-election in 2026?
What are my thoughts about what?
Running for re-election in 2026.
That's
If these are uncomfortable moments to watch, they are part of how people in charge are governing and what we see in public. We don't know what else happens in private, and there has to be some level of scrutiny on this, even if it's uncomfortable. It's not meant to be disrespectful. There are plenty of people who retain great, vigorous health and mental acuity as they age. But to be clear, that is not the only reason to assess this issue clearly, factually, objectively. There are also other ways that this issue and these systemic ways that we have an older gerontocracy leaves voters under 50 feeling underrepresented on big issues.
How do you sustain a business model in which users don't pay for your service?
Senator, we run ads.
This is an institution. I think the median age in the Senate is about 142. This is not a tech-savvy group.
It's an attempt to make TikTok better. Tic-tac-toe, a winner.
Now, it is understandable that people bring different life experiences to Congress. That's actually part of the point of having a democracy. But what if everyone in leadership is decades or 40 or 50 years behind what's happening in current tech or AI? You got 20 members of Congress over 80. You got 121 over 70. That's about 1 out of 5. And a whopping 207 who'll be 65 or older this year, meaning 40%. We couldn't fit their pictures on the graphics, so we went with these dots. Or take the Supreme Court, which has faced this question of aging jurists for decades. Lifetime appointments for the justices don't necessarily add stability these days. Longer life expectancy, plus our polarized politics, means the justices from both parties have been seen clinging to their posts with a foreseeable result. They work up until they die. And then the timeline of their natural deaths uncorks the bitter partisan battles that we've seen. I was talking about how this affects so many parts of our government, going well beyond the talk about Biden and Trump and their respective ages this year. In the Supreme Court, justices hold power because of the rules. And in Congress, as I mentioned, it's all made up. They talk about seniority like it's some natural thing, but no other public company does this. Google does not say, well, we need a new CFO. I guess we'll just bring up whoever's worked here the longest. And yet seniority is how Congress runs. It rewards age and incumbency above all. And I want to be clear, that incumbency tends to operate to lock in one generation over others and one set of incumbents over others. They're rewarded with fame and the standing, which then makes it harder for any challenger to match them in their districts or states. And that's true in both parties. And it's an imbalance that disfavors or discriminates against new challengers, whatever their age may be. Incumbents reap those advantages from fame. It helps them fundraise. Presidential campaigns are more expensive nowadays than ever before because of the size of the country and the need to run ads on television and digital. And that means, if you look at the seemingly young faces on your screen, people who have been famous for decades have an edge under this system over newer, younger candidates who would need literally hundreds of millions of dollars to try to build the name recognition in 6 or 12 months that, well, the fellas on your screen had built over many decades. Trump and Biden were two of the most recognizable Americans ever before either reached the White House. I don't think it's an accident. Nothing about this is automatic. It's actually aberrant. The United States government's systems have not changed in a long time, while a lot of other things have, from technology to life expectancy. It's an outlier. I mentioned that companies or nonprofits do not run this way. And the measures that have been discussed to limit career politicians, they have been very, very popular. For example, if Congress just ended its self-dealing seniority perks of incumbency, well, a lot of people support that. Term limits have been popular across the spectrum for a long time. The idea that you want to elect someone, check on them, and then get somebody else in there, not have them become career politicians, more comfortable with D.C. lobbyists and the D.C. circuit than their own home communities. Now, I should mention the Supreme Court itself limited attempted term limits as itself unconstitutional. Interesting that they took that view, because reformers are also pushing term limits for the Supreme Court itself, rather than continuing these lifetime appointments that have led, as I mentioned, to older and older judges, sometimes dying in office like we're in some sort of kingdom. Then there's a related big issue of whether we're ever going to curb money in politics. That would democratize and diversify power away from super rich donors and away from the famous elites who tend to win out more in that system. Those are just some reforms for a new age that could make big and immediate change.
Hey everyone, MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.